certainly physics is the study of the physical world, but that raises the question of what do you mean by the physical world? Because our notion of physics, our notion of what matter is, has changed over the centuries. So what we now view as the physical world is different from what we would have thought about it 100 years ago. Because what you've got to realize is that the progress of physics has always involved a series of these paradigm shifts where our view of reality changes. And every time it changes, it becomes more and more remote from common sense reality. And so, for example, we started off with the Newtonian paradigm, where you've got space and time and the standard laws of dynamics and things like that. That was well understood, and this sort of related to our common sense view of reality. But then as time goes on, physics introduces all these new concepts. We find that matter isn't solid, but actually it consists of billions of atoms, so it's mainly empty space. And then we discover with relativity theory that space and time are no longer absolute. They depend upon your motion and the gravitational field and things. So our common sense view that time is absolute and space is absolute is lost. And then, of course, we get the concept of general relativity, which says that space is in some sense curved in some strange sense. And then we have the idea of quantum theory, which you refer to, which again completely transforms our view of the nature of the microscopic world. So atomic physics told us that this solid chair is mainly empty space. But at least we could think of the atoms as like little billiard balls. Quantum theory comes along and tells us that no, actually, they're not like billiard balls. They're described by some quantum wave function, and they're sort of in many places at the same time. So that's a radical transformation. And then you wait a little bit longer into the middle of the 20th century, and you have all sorts of other ideas about quantum fields and extra dimensions, which arise in some of these theories of physics. So really, the point is the history of physics is a history of paradigm shifts, each one of which takes you further and further away from the view of common sense. Okay? And so the view we have now is completely counterintuitive. In fact, what it really is, it's a sort of mental model, essentially. And that's what we've learned from physics. Of course, this is supported by observational data, but it's essentially a construction of our intellects. But the point I want to say is that when we talk about quantum theory going against common sense, it is true that quantum theory is very weird. It doesn't comply with our normal concepts of common sense. But that's only one step in the history of physics. There are all these steps in the history of physics which really go against the idea of common sense. Well, I don't know whether it will go on changing forever, but we certainly haven't got to our final theory of physics. And what I'm stressing is quantum theory itself is not an end in itself. Because we've got two theories of physics. In the microscopic domain, we've got quantum theory. In the macroscopic domain, we've got relativity theory. And those two theories, they work wonderfully in their own domains. They've been tested with enormous accuracy experimentally. So we know those theories are correct in their own domain. But those theories are not compatible with each other. They just simply don't marry together smoothly. So there has to be some final theory of physics which is going to, in some sense, merge those two theories together. So that's what we sometimes call the final theory or the theory of everything. And we haven't got that theory yet. So we're still waiting. So we certainly haven't got to the end of the story. And the history of physics tells us that every time we think we've got to the end of the story, we haven't. There's always another step. So I don't know whether it will go on forever, but we certainly haven't reached the end of the story yet. You'll have a lot of physicists who will say, psi cannot be real, because it's incompatible with the laws of physics. And they will therefore say, I don't even have to consider the evidence. These phenomena can't be real because they're incompatible with physics. And a lot of eminent physicists say that. Now, I completely disagree with that view. What is true is that normal classical physics, mechanistic physics, can't explain these phenomena. I entirely agree with that. And it's not clear that even quantum physics can explain them either. So I do agree that current physics cannot explain these phenomena. But that does not mean that there won't be some future physics which can, because what I mentioned earlier was that we know that quantum theory in the microscopic domain and relativity in the macroscopic domain, they work very well, but they're not the final theory of physics. We know that even as physicists, that there must be a final theory of physics that goes beyond them. And what I would claim is that final theory of physics will contain consciousness and mind in some sense. And so when people say these phenomena can't be real because they're incompatible with physics, they can't possibly know that because we don't know what the final theory of physics is. In some sense, in quantum theory, objects are not solid, they don't have a well-defined state, they're described by a wave function, and until you observe that object, it's in a sort of superposition of states. So if I toss a coin, it's a superposition of heads and tails until I actually look at it. And so you get the famous form like the two-slit experiment where you don't know which slit it goes through, and it in some sense goes through both slits. You have this concept of non-locality and entanglement, this idea that objects can be connected even though they shouldn't, in terms of any classical causal interaction, be connected. And so there are many, and then you've got ideas of retrocausality, influences going back in time. So there are all sorts of ways in which quantum theory is weird, and that on the microscopic level, things behave in a very different way than they do at the macroscopic level. So it's very tempting for people to say, oh, well, if it's weird, we can use it to explain some other weird things like telepathy. That's a dangerous statement to make, though, because just because two things are weird, it doesn't mean you can explain one in terms of the other. What is interesting about quantum theory, though, is the whole issue of collapse of the wave function. The state of an object, whether this is heads or tails, is not known until somebody looks. So the question, and we say it's described by a wave function, and the process of observation collapses the wave function. I just took a penny, tossing a penny, but it could be any physical system. Which slit does the light go through, for example? So the question is, how do you know which, how are you going to explain that ambiguity? But the key point is that perhaps consciousness does play a role in the collapse of the wave function, because the collapse of the wave function is crucial to quantum theory. But what isn't really understood is what causes the collapse of the wave function. And some people take the view that what is crucial is consciousness. And therefore, quantum theory opens the window or opens the door to these phenomena in the sense that it may hint that consciousness is playing a role in physics. It's not, but not everybody agrees with that, because there are many different interpretations of quantum collapse. I think there's something like 7 different theories, and only one of them puts a lot of emphasis on consciousness collapsing the wave function. But clearly, the process of observation is what is causing the wave function to collapse. But the question is, what counts as an observer? Can a mouse collapse a wave function, or does it have to be a professor of physics collapsing the wave function? Or can a camera act as a wave function? We just don't know what counts as a wave function. But some people say, well, maybe it's the process of consciousness which is the key thing. And that's why many people say, well, consciousness comes in, so now at last we have to put the observer into physics, and that's what we need if we're going to accommodate mind and all mental processes. Now, I do think that's true, because I think quantum theory is important, because for the first time it hints that consciousness may have to come into physics. Because you see, for a long time physicists would say, well, consciousness is not part of physics. Physics is dealing with the third person perspective, and you do experiments. Consciousness is to do with the first person perspective. It's to do with experience rather than experiment. And so I think a lot of physicists would say, certainly in the classical tradition, they would say, well, consciousness may exist, but it's just not part of the domain of physics, because physics is dealing with experiment, with the third person perspective. I, though, am one of those physicists who thinks that consciousness must expand to accommodate experience and the first person perspective. And obviously that ties up with the idea that consciousness is involved in quantum theory. But even if that's true, you can't infer that all aspects of mental experiences are going to be explained by quantum theory. Because quantum theory says consciousness is relevant, but it's not going to explain my psychic experience. It's not going to explain what happens when I have an out-of-body experience, or when I have a precognition or whatever. So to me, it's the first step, but it's not a full explanation. And I mention that because quite a lot of people who are interested in psychic phenomena may argue that quantum theory is the final theory. And I don't believe that. I think it's not the final theory. We don't understand quantum theory anyway. So you can't just saying we explain the mystery of mind in terms of the mystery of quantum theory isn't really explaining anything, because we don't understand quantum theory anyway. I think we have to have a deeper level of physics which underlies both quantum theory and mentality. Quantum theory traditionally is associated with the microscopic world. It's associated with physics on the scale of atoms and elementary particles. And so a lot of people would say, well, all these weird phenomena are associated with quantum theory. They're only in the microscopic domain. So they're not relevant to the macroscopic world. And therefore, how can they have anything to do with mental experience? Because why should mental experience be associated with the subatomic scale? And if quantum theory was only confined to the microscopic scale, I think that would be a good argument. But actually, more and more we've learned that these weird phenomena associated with quantum theory are not just confined to the microscopic world, that they were originally discovered in that context. For example, the concept of entanglement originally was only demonstrated on very small scales, but we now know there is this non-local connection which extends to macroscopic scales as well. I mean, it's not only macroscopic molecules, it could be relevant to the brain, and they've now done these entanglement experiments which actually extend over even kilometers, I think, now. So the idea that quantum theory is only relevant to the microdomain is probably too simplistic, because what we're now learning is that there are features of quantum theory which actually extend to the macroscopic domain as well. If you take psychic phenomena seriously, I would say that one of those the implications of that is that our minds are connected. There is this entanglement between our minds, and that cannot be explained, I would argue, if consciousness is purely created by the brain. But you must bear in mind that that is the mainstream view. 90% of scientists and probably 99% of neuroscientists will assume that consciousness is generated by the brain. Now, even if it is generated by the brain, it's not inconceivable that you could have some theory of psi which is going to allow our brains to interact. But we don't have such a theory. I think the most natural implication of these phenomena is that our minds are actually connected in some way. And maybe that does link up with the concept of non-locality in quantum theory and entanglements and things. There is a link between your mind and my mind, in the sense that you have a mental space and I have a mental space, but those aren't two separate mental spaces. They're part of this communal mental space, which, if you like, might want to call universal mind or something like that. But this is mind with a big M, not mind with a little m. And it's the fact that they're connected which is crucial in this approach. I mean, we know our bodies are connected. Our bodies are connected in all sorts of physical ways. We can touch each other and transmit sound waves and light waves. But we're now talking about a connection between the minds, between your mind and my mind. And I would argue that that also does require a space. But it's not normal physical space, which is why I referred earlier to this space going beyond ordinary physical space. The crucial question is, which we began to talk about before, does the brain generate consciousness, which 99% of neuroscientists think, or is the brain merely a filter of consciousness? You see, it is indisputable that there is a correlation between your experience and your brain when you are alive, when you're awake. Any experience you have will produce something will light up in the brain. So there's undoubtedly a correlation. But that doesn't prove that the brain is generating consciousness. And clearly I can do things to the brain affect your consciousness. I mean, I can, if I hit you on the head with a hammer, you will lose consciousness. Or if I give you an anesthetic, if I put some chemical in your body, you'll lose consciousness. So no one is denying that when your consciousness is connected by the brain, it is affected by the brain. But that doesn't prove that consciousness is generated by the brain. And the other theory is that, well, maybe the brain is just a filter of consciousness. And so it's rather like a TV set, okay? You've got your TV, or even your computer, but your TV, if the TV breaks down, the image disappears, but no one believes that the image is actually in the TV set, that it's being transmitted from somewhere. And so it's being channeled through the TV set. So maybe consciousness is like that. Maybe consciousness is merely being channeled through the brain. So I see the world through my eyes and hear it through my ears and things like that, and feel it through my hands. But that's only because my consciousness is temporally, it's because consciousness with a big C is being channeled through the brain to generate consciousness with a little c, okay? But that's one particular theory, but as I said, it's not the theory most people would accept. But what I would say is that why all these experiences, so-called transpersonal or parapsychological experiences like clairvoyance or telepathy, why they're important to me is that they imply that our minds are connected. And if there is a connection between our minds, even if that isn't to do with quantum theory, and it may be to do with quantum theory, but it may relate to entanglement. But the point is, I do believe there is a connection between our minds. And if there is a connection between our minds, that means there is this universal mind in this bigger space which is connecting them. There are hints, but I would never say that the evidence for filter theory is incontrovertible, because actually it's very hard to design an experiment which distinguishes between the production and the filter model. It's just that most neuroscientists, most scientists, just to take it for granted that consciousness is generated by the brain. And that is just almost an article of faith. And it's assumed, we all accept that we can't explain how the brain has consciousness or any experience at all. Everyone accepts that. But it's just assumed that eventually, when we understand the brain well enough, we will be able to explain that. But I just think that's a pipe dream. I mean, I don't think, because I don't think the brain produces consciousness. I think it's a channel of consciousness, but of course I could be wrong, and of course this is a minority view. I would say what you learn from studying these so-called psychic phenomena, and not just psychic phenomena, some ordinary psychological phenomena, what you learn is that these phenomena do require some form of space, but it's not the same as ordinary physical space. It requires what I might call some form of mental space. When you're dealing with mind, you have to have some form of space which can accommodate mental phenomena, and that's not exactly the same as physical space. So I would say that if you want to explain psychic phenomena, or even ordinary perception, you don't need to be talking about extrasensory perception, even explaining ordinary perception, you have to go beyond the normal space which is studied by physicists, I would claim. And that's why although I'm saying I do believe in the space and the time of physics, what I'm also going to say is that you need an extended concept of space, which goes beyond that in order to accommodate mental phenomena, any mental phenomena, including things like dreams, and in some sense ordinary perception. And of course, when you get onto the whole question of psychic phenomena, ESP and things like that, it's even more so that you have to have a bigger space than the normal space which is studied by physics. And yet, in some sense, this bigger space has to contain physical space. Because after all, when we're talking about telepathy, which is a mind-to-mind interaction, that doesn't necessarily involve the physical world. It might be an interaction between your brain and my brain, but it's an interaction between our minds. But it doesn't necessarily involve a direct experience of the physical world. But when I'm talking about clairvoyance, which is having information about the physical world, then that's implying that in some sense this mental space already contains physical space. So that's the second important ingredient, that whatever our new theory is going to be, it has to contain physical space, but go beyond it. And that's why I'm saying you need an extension of physics, but an extension of physics which is not incompatible with physics as we know it. It's got to contain physics as we know it. It just has to go beyond it. I mean, that's a very interesting question, but you see, I always make a distinction between matter, mind, and spirit. We've been talking about so-called psychic phenomena, things like telepathy and clairvoyance, precognition, things like that. Now it's sort of distinct from spiritual phenomena. But what you mean by, when I say spiritual phenomena, I mean mystical experiences. What you call spiritual and what you call psychic is a bit vague, but you might say an out-of-body experience is a spiritual experience, or you might say a near-death experience is a spiritual rather than a psychic experience, or you might say some mystical experience where you transcend space and time. You might say, well, that's spiritual rather than psychic. Actually, in my view, there is no clear-cut distinction between psychic and spiritual experience, because there's a continuum, and the phenomena tend to go together. So you can't say that's psychic and that's spiritual. In fact, I say when you're talking about mind, you've got normal mind, You've got paranormal mind, if you like, and you've got spirit, mystical or transpersonal mind. And you've got phenomena on all those levels which need to be explained. For example, normal mind is our sensory world, but it also includes things like memory, and it includes things like dreams. Those are normal phenomena. Your psychic experiences include things like telepathy and precognition and clairvoyance, and then you've got your mystical experiences as well, and which I talked a little bit about. So I would say that when you want your theory of mind, in some sense, it's got to incorporate all three of those phenomena. Okay, normal, paranormal, and mystical, if you like. However, so that's what I'm saying is, so it's no good just having a theory of mind. I mean, we need a theory of mind even for normal phenomena. Okay, we don't understand even normal sensory experience. Obviously, that's to do with neuroscience. So that's a challenge in itself. But and we certainly don't have conventional science certainly doesn't have a theory of paranormal experiences. Indeed, it by and large rejects them. They're even existing. And we're even further from the theory of spiritual experience. But in my view, you need an extension of physics which is going to accommodate all three of those things. Now, the trouble is, from a sociological point of view, that's not so easy to do. I mean, there's a huge resistance against this. And I like to make a separation between matter, mind, and spirit. Now, physicists, of course, traditionally study the material world, okay? And for a long time, any reference to consciousness was taboo. Any reference to the mental world was taboo. It wasn't part of physics. But now I would argue that consciousness is part of physics, and more generally part of science. And there are all sorts of developments which have made that happen. Developments in neuroscience, obviously, developments in artificial intelligence, computer science, obviously developments in quantum theory, which we've been talking about, which say that consciousness must be relevant. And indeed, ordinary psychology is extending science to the domain of mind. But the thing about parapsychology is that it actually says that there is a direct interaction between consciousness and the physical world. And that's even more dramatic. So that's saying that my mind can in some sense affect a physical system. So if I have a glass and if I can make that glass levitate, for example, my mind is interacting with a physical object. So if I think I've got a final theory of physics, it better explain the interaction of my consciousness with that levitating glass, because otherwise it's not a theory of physics. So that's why I think you do need this extension of physics to accommodate these phenomena. But I'm making a sociological observation, which is that the first step is to get physicists to accept that consciousness and mind can be linked to matter, to have an extension of physics which accommodates mind. Now, I would say after 20 years, that is now not so heretical. It was heretical 20 years ago. Now I would say that it's becoming mainstream. And we have all these conferences about consciousness and involving physicists. So you have famous physicists like Roger Penrose, for example, a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, who's fascinated in the question of how does consciousness fit into physics. And I think he also would say, well, at the top of the Ouroboros, in my language, where you've got your final theory of quantum gravity, that's where consciousness will somehow come in. So it's not the majority view among physicists, but it's nevertheless the view of a growing number of eminent physicists that mind can be accommodated in some extension of physics. So it becomes rather contentious, and I always say that if you're going to extend physics, it'll be in two steps. You'll first extend your physics to accommodate mind and consciousness, and once that's been done, maybe you can then extend it to accommodate what are called spiritual or transpersonal phenomena. I prefer to say transpersonal because if you say spiritual or mystic, it gets you into trouble. So I prefer to say transpersonal. But the point is that my personal view is that all three of those worlds, the matter, mind, and spirit, are valid. They all represent domains of reality, and that ultimately I would like a theory which will accommodate and link all three of those worlds. But I have to say that that may be a minority view, because even the people who are interested in parapsychology very often aren't interested in the spirituality. It's only because the whole point about parapsychology is it was originally a branch of psychology, a branch of science. And they were trying to convince their colleagues that it wasn't mystical. And so they were rather anxious to avoid any references to anything too mystical, because that would merely have made the people who were on the science side very skeptical. The thing about paradigm shifts is that there's always huge resistance, because you've got your standard paradigm, okay, and that's what 90% of scientists spend their time working in. They're working on the coalface, so to speak. But then you get these little anomalies which don't fit in, which might be ESP or just something within physics, and you try and neglect those and say, oh well, we'll forget about that, it'll go away, we'll push it under the carpet. But the anomaly doesn't go away, and it gets bigger and bigger, and eventually people realize that anomaly really means you need a new paradigm. And that's how these paradigms occur. But historically what happens is there's always tremendous resistance, because after all, most scientists, they spent all their lives working on a particular paradigm. They don't want to hear that paradigm is wrong, because that will mean they've wasted all their lives. So there's a huge resistance to that. Nevertheless, eventually the anomalies, they don't go away, and the upholders of the old paradigm die away, and you get your new paradigm. But every paradigm, every new paradigm is painful, and people always resist it. And the majority of people always resist it. And of course, sometimes anomalies do go away. There are plenty of examples where it turned out it wasn't a real phenomena. And so the question is, are these anomalies, which I'm saying require a new paradigm, are they going to go away? Are they illusions, or are they really there? Obviously, I think those anomalies are real. I mean, I spent most of my lifetime thinking about them. If they're not real, I've wasted quite a lot of my life. Maybe I have wasted a lot of my life, but I think they're real, and therefore eventually I think that the clash these phenomena produce with the standard paradigm will become so severe that people won't be able to resist. There will be a revolution, there will be a new paradigm. But it may not be in my lifetime. But of course these things are gradual. Even in conventional physics, gravitational waves were predicted 100 years ago, but they weren't. We had to wait 100 years before they were discovered. Okay? And black holes were predicted, in 1916, but we had to wait another 50 years before they were discovered. The Higgs particle was predicted, and it took something like 50 years. So even within physics, we're used to the idea that you have to wait a long time for the data to come in and for the theory to come in, which very often the theory runs ahead. So it doesn't surprise me at all if we're going to wait 100 years before we have to have this new paradigm, which is even more dramatic than the paradigm shift involving gravitational waves.